the same in the same phrase, search me, God, know my heart. It's such a it's a brave, courageous thing to do, because do you really want the most perfect being in the universe to tell you what's wrong? There's quite a bit wrong, right? Yet you can, because he's a good father, and you can trust him, and he's going to bring it to you when he knows you're able to do it. Now, I'm not saying you're always going to think you're able to do it, right? You might go, God, this is a horrible time to be dealing with that in my life. But, it's okay. But at the same time, you can trust him to go, all right, this isn't the timing I'd pick. But if you're open and you're saying, God, it's okay, you can test me. You can show me what is not working.
So are you saying yes questions?
Yeah.
Okay. If you identify anxious thoughts, you could backtrack through that diagram
Yeah.
and find the source, as opposed to just trying to make it stop or...
Yeah, exactly. Because I think everything ultimately ends up coming down to one of those core questions, right? Something, and I used the example I actually picked on your husband last week, right? I said, hey, if I text Gary, and so Gary and I are good friends, just full disclosure, Gary and I know each other. And so if I text Gary and he doesn't respond back, right, which happens sometimes, and vice versa, right? If part of my value, and for me, that's the key question for me, right? Value is a big thing for me. And again, if I rewind the clock, I go, well, it's because I when I was growing up, I wasn't, the key message I got was, you're not valued, right? If you were valued, your parents would have stopped your abuse, and some of that's true. However, that was my particular, that's where the enemy particularly aimed for me, right? So now fast forward, I'm in my 50s now, this is 40-something years ago, but when Gary doesn't email me back or text me back, the temptation could be, the whisper could be, well, if you were valuable to Gary, right, he would text you back. So so now Gary has, I'm giving him some power, some authority. Now he doesn't know this or doesn't want this even, right? But because it's tagging me right in that very spot, right? That very spot of value. And so I go on this journey, right? I can start going, and it brings division and all this kind of stuff, right? Versus me going, if Gary doesn't text me back, that's not something about me, right? It's not even something about Gary, necessarily. Although it could be horrible at getting back to people. But suddenly, if I'm settled in who I am, the anxiety I have in that situation can be lessened. That doesn't mean I don't ever go, hey, Gary, it'd be great if you could text me back, It doesn't mean I don't deal with it, right? I don't mean that. But it's lost all of its, go back to the enemy schemes, right? It loses all of that power to rip relationships apart. If I go, hey, I'm comfortable, I get my value from God. If Gary doesn't text me back, that's more about Gary being busy or whatever, and I can give Gary the benefit of the doubt because I know Gary, and I know that's not his heart, and it takes all of that power away. And so I think the same is true as in other situations, right, where we find anxiety. It's going to, at some point, it comes back to one of those key things, and it's probably unique for us. Like if Gary doesn't email Jan back, she probably doesn't, because that's not her key thing, And so to answer your question, yes, I think it does come back, right? It does come back because, there's offshoots of those core things, right? Of those core questions, but they all tend to fall into one of those categories. Am I valued? Am I seen? And who am I? Am I just a poor husband, housewife, whatever, right? They all come down to one of those things. So that anxiety we feel, I think at some level ends up having its hooks or having its foundation in one of those spots. I really do. And I think that's why it's so emphasized that we have to take those thoughts captive. We have to align those things. And I'm going to jump to 2 Corinthians, which is the next slide, and I mentioned this before. It says the weapons we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. And last time we talked about what's a stronghold, right? And we placed the definitions in for the words in this verse to help get more clarity on what those are. Diverging, opposing viewpoints, every claim or assertion of claim that sets itself up in opposition to that intimately acquired truth, that experiential truth we have with God. We seize and control every inner belief and make it comply to the truth according to Christ, right? But the thing I really loved about this is that the word demolish is basically an aggressive, almost a militant term, right? These things are so bad for us. We have to demolish them. We have to pull the sledgehammer out and just, take it to these things. But realizing it's God that does that, right? It's God that does that. He demolishes these things as we give him access. So that, as we do that, to the extent we're able to bring those diverging viewpoints, those things that say, no, I'm true, we bring those and let God demolish those with the truth. To that extent, that's when we start to experience that real life of Christ in us, G.K. Chesterton said, a dead thing goes with the stream, only a living thing goes against it, right? We have to recognize how the Father of lies speaks to us, and you must recognize how he speaks to you specifically, because there's a way he whispers to you through your story, through the things that you've made agreements with, through your history, that might not be unique in the world. Like I said before, the enemy's not terribly creative, if at all creative. He repeats the same strategies on people, but he certainly is using one that's unique to your story, right? Whatever your story was, whatever you've experienced growing up, all those things, it's going to be unique to you. And it tends to kind of focus in on one of those, whether it's your identity or your value or your calling, even though they're all interconnected. But but you have to understand, how does he speak to me? How does he whisper to me when I'm stressed, alone, lonely, anxious? What's he whispering to me? Right? We have to think about what we're thinking about, because it happens like this in our brains if we don't think about it, right? So we have to think about it. So the fatherless cycle is that. And again, it's just a term I've put on it. It's just what I've noticed about how things seem to follow this kind of same pattern. I said I use the term fatherless cycle just to refer to this, again, what I've noticed in my own life, but as I've talked and worked with other people, what seems to be common. And the idea is that this fatherless cycle is not random or haphazard. It seems to follow a pattern. And this is just my attempt to try to put some terminology on it. Now, I'm not saying this is the only way Satan comes after us. I'm not saying, I've cornered the market on, at all. I'm just saying this is the strategy that I feel like I've seen him use, right? On myself, my own story, others I've talked to. It seems to kind of follow this battle plan, as it were. C.S. Lewis says, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without turnings, without milestones, without signposts. And so my attempt is to go, let me put some signposts, some milestones, some mile markers to say, hey, I think this is how the enemy operates, kind of chronologically through our lives, from when we're young to as we get into kind of middle age. And then what he seems to then go, just repeat those things, right? So it's just my attempt to kind of put some things just so that we can understand what's kind of happened in each of these different stages of life. So I'm just going to show you kind of an overview first, and then we're going to kind of jump into each one of them individually, okay? All right, so this is just kind of the overview. And I mentioned last week, if you recognize these, it's kind of the grief cycle in reverse. Right, this is the closest thing I could find, just terminology. So I borrowed from the grief cycle. If you know the grief cycle, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It's the reverse of those. So the first stage is acceptance, right? Just accept that your unique normal is right, and it kind of sets that foundation. The second phase is depression. It's a resignment, a resignation that your life is as good as it's going to get. Phase 3 is bargaining, where you're trying to get your identity, value, destiny by performing it or earning it. Phase 4 is anger. Basically, anger because ultimately you can't earn value and identity by trying to perform to get it. And then phase 5 is just denial, which is just dead, and just don't even pay attention to those inner questions. Just deaden those, all right? So we're going to go through each one of those in a little more detail, at least at a high enough level so you'll get them. But first, just a couple observations. One is about the timing, what I've noticed about the timing of this fatherless cycle. The first thing is that there's I'll call it an initiating trip through these phases, right? So you kind of go through them, and we'll talk about, again, from chronologically how it seems to play out. But there's kind of an initial trip through, and then once you're kind of through, then they repeat. But they repeat faster, right? Because the foundation is laid, so all the enemy has to do is just remind you of that foundation, and off you go to the next one, right? The second point that I've noticed around timing is that the initiating trip is usually slow. It takes years. Again, it follows the kind of a chronology or your age or the maturing, your where you are from a maturing standpoint. And then the last thing, again, that the maintenance phase, right after that initial trip, that maintenance is faster and almost happens instantaneously. So, and they don't necessarily follow chronology anymore. The second piece is around the method. So the fuel to the fatherless cycle is that damage cycle, right? Is that when I said, hey, you have these painful situations, a lie gets whispered, you make an agreement with the lie, you start responding or behaving out of that, and that forms the kind of the foundation, the fuel for kicking us into this fatherless cycle. That's really the fuel for it. So actions both done to you and actions or reactions by you tend to keep this fatherless cycle going. The second thing is each phase remains unresolved. So as we go through these, this will make more sense, but as you go through each of these phases, acceptance, depression, whatever, unlike when you go through grief, right? When you go through grief, each phase kind of resolves as you step into the next, right? You stop denying that the person has passed away in the grief cycle, but now you're angry about it, though. As your anger resolves, you step into bargaining, right? And as bargaining resolves, you step into depression, and then as depression resolves, you step into acceptance, right? So you kind of leave each of those, right? By the time you're at the acceptance phase, you're not denying this person's died anymore, right? In the grief cycle. Well, unlike that, the fatherless cycle, what I've noticed is each phase remains unresolved, right? It just builds on the next one. It's almost like scar tissue that just keeps building up, right? It never gets resolved. The other thing I've noticed is that each of the phases of the fatherless cycle, they overlap the next. So there's often not real clean breaks between each of the phases of the fatherless cycle. Another thing I've noticed is that this cycle happens often without our conscious awareness, right? It's just happening kind of under the hood, as it were. And the last thing is that it's really the inversion of the process that our true Father brings us to himself. So our true Father takes us from denial that we need him into genuine acceptance of him, right? So it's an inversion of that. So it's like a lot of things evil does, right? It's just a perversion of what's good, right? What's true. The path God takes us to bring us to himself, the enemy just goes, well, I'm just going to reverse that. I'm going to try to take us backwards. So, all right, so that's just some observations, okay? So I'm going to, again, jump into each one, and we're just going to spend a few minutes in each one. And again, our goal here is just to understand, take this and be able to go, where am I in this? Where has the enemy taken me? So that we understand how he's working in our lives, right?